Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TCG Folk, and we are back after 2 weeks of horrible weather that forced us into some schedule changes, so thank you for bearing with us. This week, we extend beyond the borders of the Twin Cities to Duluth, where we catch up with journalist, broadcaster, and documentarian Robin Washington. We talk with Robin about what it was like growing up as a Jew of color in a household where civil rights activism was at the forefront of all things, where his journalism career has taken him, and why his charoset is the only charoset you should be having at Passover on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Robin Washington, thanks for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me.
So you are up in Duluth, where you have been on and off for how long now? For quite a while, right?
Do I have to say? I'm not going to ask how old you are. So this is my second tour of duty. I'm originally from Chicago, then was wandering up in Minnesota, the Twin Cities, and wandered up Duluth, actually two harbors, many years ago, and ran the small town paper there, the Lake County News Chronicle, right after, people who know about these things can date it, right after reserve mining went out of business. And it was quite a trying time and quite moving. I found the area very beautiful, very cold, and very depressed. And it was a great time to be a journalist because you knew what you had to do to encourage people, to motivate people to survive, really. It was a pretty devastated time economically. I was having a great time as a journalist, but I had also applied for a fellowship for print science journalists to learn broadcast at WGBH, the flagship public broadcasting station in Boston. And I had a engineering magazine I had started, Minnesota Engineer, that qualified me as a science journalist. But to my surprise, I got the fellowship. And so what do you think, Two Harbors versus WGBH?
Listen, I love Minnesota, but, Boston's Boston. That's tough to pass up.
Well, I actually would have because I was having such a great time up here. But it was the last year they were offering the fellowship, so I had to take it if I ever was going to take it. So I did. And did not like Boston at first and ended up staying for 17 years. So,
well, apparently it grew on you. So you've done both newspapers and you've written for online publications, but you've also done radio also. And which do you prefer? Do you have a preference in terms of which type of media you like to work in?
Right, that's a frequent question. And before I answer that, I want to finish, just not to keep people hanging on my life here, but then I came back to the Duluth area to be the editorial page editor and then the editor of the Duluth News Tribune. Was there 10 years, left that, and now I go back and forth, mostly between here in Duluth and Boston. And so what do I do? Yes, you're right. Back and forth, not just in geographically speaking, but media-wise. It depends on the story. And for me, there's some, or not for me, for everybody, there's some stories are best told in print. Some are better told in a book or a magazine. Some are better told on TV, and some are better in radio. And so it's great to be able to go back and forth between the media because you can tell those stories in different ways and you can get different responses or different emotions, if you will, from your viewers, your readers, your listeners.
So one of the things I find really interesting about you is that you, growing up in Chicago, you grew up in an interracial household. You're a Jew of color, and you sort of grew up, as you say on your website, you were participating in sit-ins and protests when you were going back to when you were 3 years old.
A toddler,
and those were just
yes.
sort of your that was family time for the Washington family. How did that upbringing sort of inform you going forward, not just as a journalist, which I would think would be a really interesting, sort of way to get into the news business, but also as just a human being?
Right. And I would think the second one is probably more common than the first. It's not necessarily a path to journalism. If anything, I decided to be a bit more mainstream, if you will, than my parents, particularly than my mother, by becoming a journalist and figuring, look, I'm all about social justice and about being humane, treating people with respect, and definitely equality. But somewhere along the line, I decided the best way that I can address those issues is through mainstream journalism. And I point out mainstream. There's nothing wrong with alternative journalism. There's nothing wrong with even radical journalism. I guess I've tried some of that. But mainstream journalism, or the dreaded mainstream media, as some may cast it these days, is probably it's called broadcasting for a reason, right? You're reaching large numbers of people. So if I can bring the messages of peace, justice, equality, which should be the norm of human existence, right, to the masses, then I think I've accomplished something. And I think I have, by the way. I think I've been blessed to be able to do so.
So you mentioned you were a little more mainstream than your mother. Was she the driving force in the family in terms of civil rights activism? Yeah,
most definitely. Not to sell my father short. Again, my father was African American and not black. African American and not Jewish. My mother was Jewish and not black, and that makes me, by every definition of Judaism and blackness, 100% of both. Right? If your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish, and if you're any degree black, one drop, I'm a heck of a lot more than one drop. So yes. If I'm not black, then Obama wasn't either, and he still is, as far as I know. They both were pretty radical. I mean, the mere idea that they were together and got together in the late 40s, early 50s is pretty radical in itself. But not for them. I mean, their lives were in such circles. My mother was more the organization person, though. So she was an officer of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality Chicago chapter, and also of the local NAACP. What's interesting is that she was the housing chairman of CORE, I believe, and the education chairman of NAACP. And then she had a running buddy who was also female, who was the housing chairman of NAACP and the education chairman of CORE. And this is a tactic that I've learned, both growing up, with it happening right in front of my nose, but also as an adult going back and looking at her papers that she's passed on, so has my father, and looking at her materials and ephemera, and realizing that for the most part, a lot of her activities centered around 5 women, multiracial, who did all the work. If you look at the movement history, and I've studied quite a bit of this as an adult and as a journalist and documentarian, if you look at the movement history, we know the names of King and James Farmer and Bayard Rustin these days, but we don't know the names of Bernice Fisher, Joanne Robinson, and it's the women in the movement who were doing all the work. They were the ones who were licking the envelopes and getting the stuff in the mail and getting the meeting notices out. And so my mother had a similar group of women who were behind the scenes in Chicago. And one of the tricks they did was to use their married names and their maiden names on different in different organizations. So and then they would have different they would actually start new organizations. So in essence, there would be maybe 5 organizations with these 5 women and anybody else they could get to join, all using different permutations of their names. And then to make themselves even more powerful, they created an umbrella organization. So the idea was that the authorities wouldn't have any idea that this great movement was this core of radical women.
That's amazing. I mean, that's certainly a history that I didn't know about in that era, and I certainly haven't spent as much time, immersed in it as you have. But that's really a fascinating experience to grow up around. And I think that's really, it sounds that looking at some of your work, that experience definitely informed your work going forward, as especially some of the documentaries that, you talk about on your website as having participated in.
Right, absolutely, right. And the other thing I would point out is, you could say, okay, well, what were they doing? The main, one of the main impetus or focus areas was desegregating schools, and particularly in the North. This was in Chicago, and so it was de facto segregation. My mother was a co-author of with one of those running buddies, Faith Rich, of an article that ran in the, I think it was 1958 NAACP crisis, called De Facto Segregation in Chicago Public Schools. So the whole idea, this is just a few years after Brown v. Board Education, was, all right, we know about de jure segregation, legal segregation in the South. What about de facto segregation, or what we call today institutional racism, in the North, where it's, neighborhoods are segregated, so the schools will be too. We can't do anything about it, says the Board of Education. And we thought we could do something about it. I'm not hesitant at all to say that at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, I was part of that we, because I have to tell you, I don't have any memory of not knowing what this was all about. So as we went on marches and sit-ins, a major one at the Chicago Board of Education in 1963, shortly before the March on Washington, I remember it like yesterday, and I remember what it was about. Maybe it's the mind that goes back and fills in the blanks, but again, I have no memory of not knowing what we were fighting for.
So why do you think it's so important that Jews, not necessarily Jews of color, but all Jews, sort of recognize and take part in the sort of ongoing, plight in terms of, trying to fight the institutional racism that clearly is still an issue, not just here in Minnesota, but around the country?
First of all people, not just Jews. This is a fight for everybody. And then beyond even this fight and even justice in general, today with the nonsense out of Washington and the example of our president, can I put it any other way? Can you at least stand for something? Anybody, everybody on this planet, stand for something. I'm not going to get political one way or the other on this, except to say, I don't know what this guy stands for. Does he have a code of ethics of anything besides for himself? He said such stuff point blank that, I could be a Democrat, I could be a Republican a few years ago, and he said, I'll be a Republican because they're easier to fool. That doesn't speak to many values. And so the first thing is that you stand for something. The best thing I can say about the Trump presidency is that now I at least have some appreciation for my conservative friends who, may not have been my fellow travelers in the past, although I remain my journalistic objectivity, and I certainly believe in journalistic fairness. It's part of my religion, too. But, is at least if you stand for something, if you truly believe in something, as long as it's not oppressing somebody else, that's a start. That's, a reason for being on this planet. Now, the problem is we do have oppression all over the place in all different forms. And so, yes, it's incumbent on those of us who think far enough to realize, well, you know what? Our fellow human beings are suffering, or there's things that are just not right. And can I do something about it? So you're charged to do something. At least that's my view. And Jews have a special place, right? Jews are a special people. It's great being a special people. You get responsibilities with it. But because of our history of oppression, we should be more attuned to others being oppressed. And when we say never again, we don't own the never again. We're not saying never again just for us. Nobody better not hit us again. It's never again for anyone. And there's actually a selfish motive, if you will, behind it, and some criticism of this. Those who might criticize Jews in the civil rights movement saying they were helping themselves. Well, yeah, you are. because it goes back to the I'm forgetting the name of the World War I submarine captain, right? But they came for the scientists, they came for the engineers, they came for the Romani people, and they came for us. And so Jews have always been on that train somewhere, right? Always somewhere along that line. And it shouldn't take much of your, imagination to realize that coming for you is, part of the game, part of the story, unfortunately.
And I know Paul Wellstone, beloved Minnesota senator, as he is at least attributed to him as having said, is we all do better when we all do better.
Right.
And,
he didn't.
That's a line. That's a line that we use about yes, and that's a line we use at least in the Jewish, Jew folk about the Jewish community and helping all the organizations better reach their people. But I think it's a lot broader than that too, in terms of when everybody is better off, everybody's better off.
There's a converse to that. It may be just me trying to find a segue to something that's on my mind and kind of annoying me. But just recently, I think a couple days ago on myjewishlearning.com, which I write for occasionally, I don't know who wrote this because the byline was myjewishlearning.com, and it was an answer or apology, if you will, about Jews in the slave trade. And it was somehow going back to the Nation of Islam and their book, The Secret History Between Blacks and Jews, and that said Jews were disproportionately responsible for the slave trade, and it gives all kinds of reasons why not. Okay, fine, whatever. I am very familiar with that discussion. I was in Boston as the managing editor of the African American newspaper when that book came out, and our publisher was good friends of, was a childhood friend of Farrakhan, and they were still friends, and cool for them, okay. So it put me in an interesting situation of dealing with the book and how to report about it. But, so yes, you can debate it all different ways. Henry Louis Gates has got all kinds of answers to it. The feeling basically among scholars is no, Jews were not disproportionately represented in the slave trade, or at least not in any meaningful numbers. All right, fine. I'm great with that argument. Where am I going with this? The problem is that whoever wrote this thing for My Jewish Learning the other day said, and don't forget, thousands of free blacks also became slaveholders. Well, wait a minute. First of all, two wrongs don't make a right, which is the theme I was going for, coming off of what we were just saying, what other people are doing, right? We all do better when we all do better. So if some of us are doing wrong, does that mean we all do wrong? No. So that doesn't excuse it at all. But then secondly, it's completely wrong. There's no evidence I know of that says thousands of free blacks own slaves. And how somebody can just throw that out there is beyond me. It's kind of like your guilt working overtime, except that your ancestors weren't all wonderful, beautiful people. That has happened in every group. And move on. Deal with it and move on. Don't ascribe, bad behavior to someone else as an excuse for your own. And certainly don't make up numbers to justify it. So, got that off my chest.
No, but I think that brings up, does bring up a fascinating, I certainly don't agree with the counter-argument, but I think it brings up an interesting counter-argument at least, I think it's always interesting to pursue multiple sides of an issue, whether you agree with it or not. I think that's how we become an informed citizenry.
Right.
But being a journalist, I also, like you, I sort of, journalism and a free press is also part of my religion as well. So it's, who am I to say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's too much to ask for some semblance of accuracy, right? No. I think that's, we strive, for that in our jobs, both you and I. And if we get something wrong, we correct the record, but you hope you get it right the first time, right? Or at least attribution. I mean, if
yes.
they read that somewhere and they say according to, okay, well then you can deal with where it came from. So anyway, like I said, I got that off my chest. I don't need to belabor.
No, I think that's really interesting, though. So as you have gone through your experience, is there been sort of one side of your, either Black or Jewish side that you've been interested in sort of pursuing more about, or do you sort of look at both things in equal measure?
You mean the are you more Black or are you more Jewish question?
I wasn't exactly the question I was going for, but more in terms of
wouldn't be the first time I've been asked that. So, as I know, said,
but it sounds so much more insulting when you say it that way, which is not what I was going for.
Yeah. But as I said, I'm 100% of each, and that's the way I truly, I don't have any other reality. This is what I've always been, right? And if anything, going back to this whole civil rights thing, that's part of my religion as well. I think the three cornerstones of what you would call my, what do you want to say, a creed rather than religion, right? What, what are the things that drive me ethically would be equality, justice, Judaism, and journalism. And they're pretty much saying the same thing, but not necessarily. They have different approaches to it. So I'd have to say being Black, too. That's something that after a while you get used to it, I guess. You don't realize, that's part of what drives me, too, But again, that's wrapped up in the justice thing, too. No, but I will say, though, having said I'm 100% of each and 200%, that doesn't mean I don't cause a little trouble. So in Jewish circles, I might bring up a Black issue, and in Black circles, I might bring up a Jewish issue, and in gay circles, I'll bring up a straight issue, and in straight, it's just I do think that is part of maybe the chemical reaction of dealing who I am with, who I've been blessed and born to be, of the family I grew up in. So I'm always thinking of the other. Because usually in any group of people, I am one of the others, if not two of the others, right? And then I find people are more other than I am, and so I have to check myself. But to me, that comes naturally, and I don't know if it's altruism or not, but I do think it's empathy, and I do think that it's something that, again, I'm blessed to have, and I have to remind myself not everybody looks at it that way. If you grow up in any homogenous environment, you're not going to as readily think of the other as someone who grows up in a more diverse and certainly interpersonally diverse situation.
No, I think that is very true. Well, Robin Washington, thank you so much. We're going to let you get out of here, but first we have our final two questions we always wrap with. What is your favorite Jewish holiday?
My favorite? That's an interesting question. I guess I have to say Pesach, just for the, the regular reasons. I mean, for just what it is, for the Seder, for the fact. I think what's interesting about Pesach is not just the Seder. Here we have this ancient holiday, and we've got all these different Haggadot these days, right? You've got,
absolutely.
Yeah, but they're all basically telling the same story, and how that can endure and actually allow itself all these variations is pretty remarkable. You have some holidays that are just straight. I mean, you don't have variations on Yom Kippur, right? I mean, it's like, right. Fast for 3 hours and then go swimming or something like that. I don't think so, You may have some modern interpretations, of course, and in the religion, the beauty of Judaism, right, is we're always questioning, so we're always reinventing ourselves and reinventing our holy days, our holidays, and holidays, and our observance. But nothing is, I think, as flexible as Pesach, and I think that maybe that's one reason why it does endure. Here, I'll bring it politically. we have the whole debate, I don't know if it's left and right, of the Supreme Court of whether or not the Constitution is a living document or it's, what the physicists would call solid state, right? That it was written once and that's it. It doesn't change. I think Scalia was fond of saying, there were no airplanes when they wrote this. So, okay. But Pesach, Haggadot are not solid state. They are definitely living documents. And I find that a joy. And to both celebrate something ancient, and both, of course, the core of it is deliverance from slavery, deliverance from oppression, but to find a contemporary and relevant to you interpretation is what makes it come alive.
And final question is favorite Jewish food?
Well, again, an easy one is hamantashen. I mean, who doesn't like that?
Do you have a particular flavor of hamantashen you like?
No, but I think the ones that use... I take it back. What am I talking about? No, charoset. And my charoset.
Okay, so...
going back to Hanukkah. Going back to Pesach.
Pesach. All right, I'll bite. What makes your charoset great?
Raisins. And I have a commentary about that on my Jewish Learning, if I may make a plug. And it's searching my
ancestors, by all means.
Searching my family tree for raisins. This came from an argument with my first wife, who was Eastern European Jewish, and my background with African American is Western European, is German and English, and actually more German, as I've found out from doing the lineage. But anyway, and so we had this when we were first married, we made charoset, and she said, raisins, why are you putting raisins in there? I said, because you do. Well, you have that argument, anywhere. But later we found out that, and this was a little bit back before, all these different Haggadot, we found out that raisins were a Sephardic ingredient. But wait a minute, this didn't make any sense. My family wasn't the least bit Sephardic, or at least not in recent centuries. And so, okay, it made sense it was there. She reluctantly agreed that there may be some basis to it, And more recently, I found out within the last 10 years that indeed our family, the name is Birkenstein, and if you meet a Birkenstein, it's a relative because there are very, very few of us. My middle name is Burke, is my mother's maiden name. The Birkenstein family originated in Spain, or at least at one point we were Spanish Jews. We did not convert, so we left, and we went to Germany, where apparently that's where we picked up the name. It was common for Jews to pick up names of trees and birds, so we went the tree route. So I'm guessing that the recipe may be centuries old. I'm going to live with that one until somebody shows me otherwise.
That's fantastic. And we will absolutely link to the article. I read it earlier, and it is fun and fantastic and fascinating. And I think people will appreciate the journey of that recipe, because that is, food is obviously such a core part of Judaism, and the people's recipes, they are their own, and they will defend them to the bitter end,
right?
As being theirs. So I think people will very much appreciate it, but we will absolutely link to it. Well, Robin Washington, thank you very much for joining us this week. We're happy to get to connect with you, and thanks again for being here.
Thanks again. Shalom.
Shalom. Thanks again to Robin Washington for joining us this week. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It helps other people find the show. You can find us on Apple Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, almost any place you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next week.